So, what do you think of, or what image pops in your head when you hear the phrase food fight? See, these words can evoke a powerful response. When I think about it, I think that many kids crave the chaos of it, while most parents cringe at the cleanup. And a picture that pops in my head is always of a milk volcano in my high school cafeteria. You see, there was this group of upperclassmen at the cool kids table. And one day they thought it would be funny to toss a milk carton up over their head to the table behind them. I watched it all unfold, and it seemed so simple and small, but became something much larger. It was like slow motion. The carton went up in the air, staying upright the entire time, and then it landed perfectly with a thud, bottom down, not spilling a drop, dead center in the table full of kids behind them. Then it happened. It was like a moment of silence before the milk explosion. See, there was this backsplash happening inside of the carton, and then Old Faithful, a geyser of milk, erupted up through the tiny opening, spraying all over the table of kids sitting in stunned silence. Now, if I'm being honest, it was awesome. However, I would have been pretty ticked off if it happened to me. But then I also have read up recently about the world's biggest food fight called La Tomatina Festival in the small eastern town of Bunol in Spain. Approximately 20,000 people, which is double the town's population of about 9,000, descend upon this small town on the last Wednesday of August each year, and they hurl more than, get this, 30,000 pounds of tomatoes at one another for about an hour in the world's biggest food fight. Now, even though the origins of this strange event seem to be a bit shrouded in mystery, the decades-old ritual has been said to have all started with a simple food fight between friends, but has now grown into something monumental. Today's twist has very little to do with an actual food fight, and more so a fight over food. But before we dive any deeper into our episode, let's recap where we have been in our series. For the past few weeks this summer, we have been talking about fighting for our faith. Now, the world is not a friend to it, and there are those who would seek to destroy it. So we must engage in a battle for our faith in Christ to be strong and resolute. And in this series, we've looked at and learned from the lives of David and Samuel, along with the wise words of Solomon. In the midst of it all, we must be reminded that while we have challenged you to fight over the last few weeks, it must be a different fight. Not like one you would find yourself in when the schoolyard bully is calling you names on the playground or tossing a carton of milk on your table. Instead, we have hoped for you to grasp this crucial concept. Fighting for our faith means that we fight with weapons that are more formidable than our fists and more accurate than our arguments or opinions. Weapons that the ancient church referred to in this way. We find this in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 through 5, and it says, "For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. We take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ." See, here we find the Apostle Paul giving instructions to the church on just how to fight. He makes it clear we don't fight like the world does. It is instead a spiritual battle. So for the last few weeks, we have looked into Scripture to discern how we ought to fight for our faith. To ensure we're fighting with the right weapons, we have been inspired by ancient stories of God's people who either fought for or didn't fight for their faith. Let's take a couple of minutes to remind you of the lessons we've learned and see how they build a foundation for our story today. The first couple of weeks we learned from the life of a guy named David. In week 1, the big idea was simply this: God's faithfulness gives me strength for future battles. Then in week 2, we saw from the life of David, the big idea was making the right choice is always an option. Even when David didn't do it, it was still an option, which in turn built a base for the wise words from David's own son, Solomon, which are found in the pages of the book of Proverbs. Then, week 3, we learn from Solomon's life the big idea: the choices I make today lead to the person I'll be tomorrow. Then last week, we learned from another son of a solid sister in the faith, a guy by the name of Samuel, who was the set-apart son of our dear, sweet, faithful Hannah. And in week 4, the big idea was simply this: when I fully surrender to God, He takes full responsibility for me. All of these set the stage for our final story today. Remember our opening about a food fight? Well, we will actually see it as more of a fight over food, and creates the scene and setting for our final fight today. Today we find ourselves in 2 episodes from the life of Daniel, and the second is more well known than the first, but I'd argue that without the first, I truly believe we would never have gotten to one of the most famous stories found in Scripture. I want you to actually think of them this way. Chapter 1 of Daniel could be called Fight for the Right Food, while chapter 6 would be Fight Not to Become Food. See, chapter 6 is when Daniel's in the lion's den. Many of us have heard or even know well that story. It sounds like an epic adventure, but we really got to ask the question, how did he get there? And in order to answer, we got to go all the way back to chapter 1. So as we turn to chapter 1 and the first couple verses, I want to set the stage a little bit. There was the children of Israel. They were ruled by a king in Judah named Jehoiakim, who was an evil king. And so God was going to punish. And so he sent in to be overthrown by the Babylonian army and the king Nebuchadnezzar. You see, the army besieged the capital city, taking over the land of God's people. And in order to show their strength and their complete control, the Babylonian army took sacred objects from the temple of God, and took them back to their temple in Babylon. They also took captives back to their land. So this is where we pick up our story in chapter 1, verse 3 through 6. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men, he said. Make sure they are well-versed in every branch of learning and are gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. Now you see, the goal of the conquering nation was to select out and indoctrinate the best and brightest young leaders. This would strengthen their own kingdom and weaken the nation that was in exile. So here we see that Daniel, even in a very difficult scenario, was being perfectly placed to be used by God when the time is right. As we pick back up in verse 8, it says, "But Daniel was determined not to defile himself." That's a key phrase I want us to hold on to. Determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Now God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. Now, different translations say a different way. In fact, in the NIV, verse 9 is translated like this: "Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel." That word's going to be key, favor. Hold on to that. As we continue in verse 10, it says, "But he," meaning the chief, responded to Daniel, "I am afraid of my lord the king, who has ordered that you eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the other youths your age, I'm afraid the king will have me beheaded." Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. "Please test us for 10 days. He came up with a solution. Please test us for 10 days on the diet of vegetables and water, Daniel said. At the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see. The attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. Determined not to defile. That's a powerful phrase. You see, Daniel was determined not to fault anything. He was going to stand firm and fight to stay connected to God instead of corrupted by the culture. I believe this is the same concept we learned from David in week 2. The big idea was simply making the right choice is always an option, and Daniel is seeing that as well. This was seemingly such a small thing, right? But Daniel had to be willing to fight for the details. He was determined not to defile himself even in the small things like this food. You see, Daniel knew that the king's food had items in it that went against the laws and guidelines that God had set forth for his people in order to follow him. Daniel chose to honor his God above all else. I believe that this shows that he understood the big idea from week 3 in Solomon's wise words, where he said, the choices I make today lead to the person I'll be tomorrow. We get to see clearly how this plays out in Daniel's life. The choices Daniel was making earned the trust and respect of the chief of staff. So Daniel's differing viewpoint was able to be heard. You see, he didn't just throw a fit and try to cause chaos. He handled it well. He gave an option. He said to him, give us a test and let's see how that plays out. And so we continue in verse 15 to see how it does. At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. This was God's favor. Continue in verse 16. So after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and wine provided for the others. God gave, hear that, God gave these 4 men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. And then God gave, hear that, God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meanings of visions and dreams. That phrase, God gave, was repeated a couple times. This was God's favor, imparting special abilities on them. As we continue in verse 18, it says, when the training period ordered by the king was completed, the chief of staff brought all the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and no one impressed him as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the royal service. Whenever the king consulted them in any matter regarding wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. Again, God's favor. This leads us to today's big idea, the thing we want you to hold on to, and it's simply this. Fighting for our faith fosters God's favor. Let me say that again. Fighting for our faith fosters God's favor. Now, I want you to be careful to really understand God's favor here. We're not talking about financial gain, a health and wealth gospel, big houses and private planes. You see, the favor of God is his goodness and special kindness in the midst of his sovereignty. See, God gave special treatment. He gave abilities in order to accomplish his perfect will, not just make their lives easier. So we see what happened from the start of our story. Now let's set the stage for chapter 6. See, first it was the Babylonian Empire and King Nebuchadnezzar that had Daniel in captivity. Then in chapters 2 through 5, we see things play out where these groups, the Medes and the Persians, come in and they overthrew the Babylonians. And now 2 guys named Darius and Cyrus would be the leaders. And Daniel and the rest of his crew just moved from being in captivity from one nation to another. So another regime change, another power struggle, yet the same old circumstances for Daniel, living in captivity. I'm sure he may be feeling sick of this. I mean, does he just throw up his hands, give up, and blame God for not honoring his faithfulness? Let's see how the story plays out. We pick up in verse 1 of chapter 6. Darius the Mede decided to divide the kingdom into 120 provinces, and he appointed a high officer to rule over each province. The king also chose Daniel and 2 others as administrators to supervise the high officers and protect the king's interest. Listen to this. Daniel soon proved himself more capable than all the other administrators and high officers. Because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire empire. God's favor. Once again, another big deal. A completely different political power recognizes that there is something different about Daniel. No matter his environment or his circumstances, Daniel seemed to rise to the occasion. And I don't think that this was just a coincidence. See, I believe when we honor God above all else, often we will rise to the top. People will take notice and will stand out. Remember, fighting for our faith fosters God's favor. As we pick up in verse 4 and 5, it says, Then the other administrators and high officers began searching for some fault in the way that Daniel was handling government affairs. They didn't like Daniel and they were gunning for him, but they couldn't find anything to criticize or condemn. Listen, he was faithful, always responsible, and completely trustworthy. So here's what they concluded. Our only chance of finding grounds for accusing Daniel will be in connection with the rules of his religion. Daniel's faithfulness to God led him to be faultless in his job. Have you ever thought about that? I mean, think about it. Daniel was even in a government job, and a government job that was of a kingdom not of God. I think that's interesting. So what could we learn from that? What if the worst thing that people could say about us was that they could only find fault in connection with the guidelines regarding our faith? So the question is, how are you living this out in your workplace? What are people saying about you? Pick up in verse 6, it says, So the administrators and high officers went to the king and said, Long live King Darius. We are all in agreement, we administrators, officials, high officers, advisors, and governors, that the king should make a law that will be strictly enforced. Give orders that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except you, your majesty, they're laying it on thick here now, will be thrown into the den of lions. And now, your majesty, issue and sign this law so it cannot be changed, an official law of the Medes and Persians that cannot be revoked. So King Darius signed the law. And here it is, another seeming slap in the face. These dudes were scheming to get Daniel. I mean, so frustrating and unfair. So how in the world does he respond? Listen to verse 10. But when Daniel learned that the law had been signed, what did he do? He got mad and complained. He rounded up his friends and they stormed the castle. He pouted in the corner. No, it says when he learned that the law had been signed, he went home and knelt down as usual in his upstairs room with its windows open towards Jerusalem. He prayed 3 times a day, just as he had always done, giving thanks to God. As usual. I love that phrase. He just kept doing what he'd always done, giving thanks to God. You see, Daniel had definitely built a pattern of prayer. This was plain and simple his natural response to whatever he faced, not a pattern of pouting or panic or trying to gain control with power or pride. He lived into a powerful pattern of prayer. And now let's see the results as we continue in verse 11. Then the officials went together to Daniel's house and found him praying. Of course he did, because he did it every day, 3 times a day. And he was asking for God's help. So they went straight to the king and reminded him about his law. Did you not sign a law that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions? Yes, the king replied. That decision stands. It is an official law of the Medes and the Persians that cannot be revoked. I wonder if they were rubbing their hands and maybe high-fiving each other. They were getting excited. Then they told the king, that man Daniel, one of the captives from Judah, is ignoring you and your law. He still prays to his God 3 times a day. Hearing this, the king was deeply troubled. He liked Daniel, and he tried to think of a way to save Daniel. He spent the rest of the day looking for a way to get Daniel out of this predicament. And in the evening, the men went together to the king and they said, Your Majesty, you know that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no law that the king signs can be changed. So at last, the king gave orders for Daniel to be arrested and thrown into the den of lions. And then the king said to him, May your God, whom you serve so faithfully, rescue you. He knew. I mean, even the king knew something was different about Daniel. And Daniel understood what we learned way back with David in week 1. God's faithfulness gives me strength for our future battles. And Daniel was leaning on that strength. Let's continue. In verse 17, it says, A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed the stone with his own royal seal and the seals of his nobles so that no one could rescue Daniel. Yeah, right. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night fasting. He refused his usual entertainment and couldn't sleep at all that night. Very early the next morning, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. And when he got there, he called out in anguish, Daniel, servant of the living God, was your God, whom you serve so faithfully, able to rescue from the lions? Daniel answered, Long live the king. My God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths so that they would not hurt me. For I have been found innocent in his sight, and I have not wronged you, your majesty. God's favor. See, Daniel, from an early age, had decided and determined not to defile himself and lived into his pattern of prayer. This is how he chose to fight. Remember, fighting for our faith fosters God's favor. Then in verse 23, it says, The king was overjoyed and ordered that Daniel be lifted from the den. Not a scratch was found on him, for he had trusted in his God. I believe that this shows the real life impact of the big idea we learned from Samuel last week. When I fully surrender to God, he takes full responsibility for me. We also need to see that Daniel's fight for faith not only affected him positively, but God's favor in this life brought God's message of salvation to the entire world. Let's look at the final few verses in 25 through 28. It says, Then King Darius sent this message to the people of every race. Listen to this, every race and nation and language, the entire world. Throughout the world, he said, Peace and prosperity to you. I decree that everyone throughout my kingdom should tremble with fear before the God of Daniel. Now, this is the same guy who just had said, don't pray to anybody else but me for 30 days. And now he's saying, honor the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he will endure forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his rule will never end. He rescues and saves his people. He performs miraculous signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Once again, we see God's favor is on Daniel because fighting for our faith fosters God's favor. Not only was it Daniel who prospered during the reign of all these ungodly kings, but think about the countless numbers who now may have turned to God, the God of Daniel, as the one true God. I mean, check that out. This was a pagan king who is uttering this paragraph of praise to God. And it all started with a big old food fight. Or better yet, a fight for faith over food. But we see that it grew into something so much more monumental. So what about you today? What does this have to say to you? The question I have is, are you determined not to defile yourself. Think about the things. Maybe it's food. Maybe it's lust. Maybe it's some other thing in your life, an addiction. Maybe it's anger. Maybe it's relationships. Are you determined not to defile yourself? Are you willing to fight, to stay connected to God instead of corrupted by the culture? Another question I can ask you is, what is your current pattern of response? Is yours a pattern of power or pride or panic or pouting? Let me ask, how will you adopt a pattern of prayer today? We would love to walk with you on this fight for your faith. And if you're watching one of our live streams today, we have a prayer team ready to pray with you and seek God's guidance on these next steps. Simply click the live prayer link now and we'll follow up with you. Ultimately, we want you to remember our big idea today. Fighting for our faith fosters God's favor.